There are habits in my life that never made sense to explain. Not because I didn't notice them. I did. I could see the pattern. I just couldn't locate where it came from. And that made it hard to work with because the reaction always felt older than the situation it showed up in. I'd be standing in a completely ordinary moment, nothing charged, nothing dramatic, and my body would already be ready, slightly tightened, slightly alert, as if something important was about to happen even when nothing was. That kind of response messes with you after a while. You start assuming there's something you haven't uncovered yet, some memory, some insight, some missing piece that would finally make it make sense. But over time, it became clear to me that some habits don't form inside a single lifetime. They arrive intact. They come in with the soul. And once I stopped trying to force those patterns into a psychological story, the way I understood habit, safety, and choice shifted completely. Because what my body was doing had nothing to do with the present moment. It was protecting continuity across lives. What took me a long time to understand is that the body doesn't need a story in order to stay loyal to something. For a long time, I assumed that if a habit didn't respond to awareness, then I must be missing some part of the story, some memory, some moment where it started. But what I eventually saw is that the body doesn't organize itself around explanation. It organizes itself around coherence. If a pattern arrives with the soul, the body treats it as real from the very beginning. It doesn't need to know why it's there. It doesn't question it. It simply recognizes the orientation and responds accordingly. And that's why some habits feel immune to understanding. They weren't formed through trial and error in this life. They were learned slowly. They arrived intact, already functional, and already trusted. I used to think that meant something was wrong. That if I couldn't trace a reaction back to childhood or experience, then I just hadn't gone deep enough yet. But over time, it became clear that the body wasn't protecting a memory at all. It was protecting an agreement. Not an agreement made in words and not something I consciously chose here, but a carried orientation, a way of being that once mattered enough to remain active, staying alert, staying ahead, being ready before something happened. Those patterns didn't feel dramatic inside me. They felt practical, almost responsible, like something that had done its job really well for a long time. And when you see habits that way, the whole relationship changes. Because trying to override an incarnational agreement doesn't just feel difficult, it feels wrong at a bodily level. The system isn't confused, it isn't resisting growth, it's honoring continuity. I began to notice how those patterns showed up in completely ordinary moments. A familiar tightening that appeared even when nothing was at stake. A readiness that switched on before the situation asked for it. A subtle sense of being ahead of the moment without knowing why. Those weren't random habits. They were the body carrying something forward that hadn't finished yet. Not unfinished in a broken way, unfinished in a still alive way. And once I stopped treating those patterns as problems to solve and started relating to them as agreements to listen to, the internal pressure began to ease. There was less urgency to fix myself, less demand for resolution, and more space to notice what the body was actually protecting. Because agreements don't dissolve through insight, they dissolve through completion. And completion doesn't come from effort, it comes from recognition. I can think of a few moments right now that felt insignificant at the time, nothing I would have pointed to as important, and yet those were the moments where something ancient was clearly still active. I didn't understand them at the time, I just lived them. And that's the part that keeps coming back to me. Those moments weren't dramatic, they didn't announce themselves as important. They looked like ordinary days, ordinary choices, ordinary reactions. But something in them carried more weight than the situation itself. A sense of familiarity that didn't come from memory. A pull that didn't belong to the present. And at the time, I treated those moments like noise, background behavior, something to eventually clean up or grow out of. I assumed that once I understood myself better, they'd naturally just fall away. And they didn't. What I see now is that those moments weren't asking to be fixed. They were asking to be recognized, not analyzed, not reframed, just seen for what they were carrying. Because when a pattern comes from the soul, it doesn't show up as a problem. It shows up as loyalty, loyalty to something that once mattered enough to be brought forward intact. And the body knows how to carry that kind of loyalty without explanation. It doesn't argue with it. It doesn't question whether it still applies. It simply keeps the orientation alive. That's why those patterns can feel so persistent. Not heavy, not dramatic, just quietly present. Like they've always been there, just doing their job, waiting for the moment they're no longer needed. I've noticed that when I stop trying to move past those moments and instead let them be what they are, something shifts in how I relate to them. There's less pressure to make sense of them immediately, less urgency to decide what they mean. They start to feel less like obstacles and more like signals. And not signals pointing forward, but signals pointing backward toward something unfinished that wants acknowledgement. And acknowledgement doesn't look like digging. It doesn't look like effort. It looks like just allowing the pattern to exist without trying to override it. That's when something subtle really starts to happen. The pattern doesn't just disappear. It doesn't resolve itself on cue, but it stops demanding attention in the same way. Almost like it knows it's been seen. And once that recognition is there, the body doesn't have to work as hard to keep it active. The vigilance softens on its own. The readiness eases without instruction. The habit loosens, not because it was forced to, but because it no longer has to prove that it belongs. And that's how these things complete. Not through change, but through being met. And I'm still living this. I'm still noticing it in real time, in moments that don't look like anything special. A pause that lasts a little longer than it used to. A reaction that doesn't fully engage. A familiar pattern that shows up and then quietly steps back. Nothing I would have called progress in the old sense, just life continuing with a little less ancient weight carried forward each time. So what surprised me most was how choice came back. Not suddenly, not as a decision, and not in the moment I thought it would. I used to imagine choice as something you reach for, like a fork in the road, where you finally do the right thing instead of the familiar. But that's not how it showed up at all. Choice returned quietly. It showed up after the loyalty had already been honored, after the body no longer felt like it had to stay on watch, after the pattern had been allowed to exist without being argued with or corrected. I didn't feel more empowered. I didn't feel clearer. I just noticed that the pull wasn't as strong. The habit would still appear, but it felt optional in a way that it hadn't before. Not because I reminded myself to choose differently, but because the urgency behind it wasn't there anymore. That's when I realized something important. See, choice doesn't come from effort, it comes from space. When a pattern is still carrying an ancient responsibility, there isn't room for choice. The system is already fully occupied. It's already doing what it believes it must do. There's no gap there. But once the responsibility is seen and allowed, a gap naturally begins to open. And in that gap, choice doesn't feel like willpower. It feels like availability. Sometimes it shows up as a pause. Sometimes as a different impulse entirely. And sometimes it just shows up as doing the same thing, but without that same internal weight attached to it. That was new for me. See, I stopped measuring change by whether the habit disappeared. I started noticing whether I felt compelled, whether the body felt like it had to follow through, or whether it could just wait. That waiting wasn't passive. It was alive, attentive, and present. And from there, choice wasn't something I had to make. It was something that was simply there. I could feel the difference immediately, not as a thought, but as a physical sense of openness. Like the moment was no longer closing in on me. And that's when I understood that honoring loyalty doesn't lock you into the past. It frees you from the system of having to repeat it. Choice isn't the opposite of habit. It's what becomes possible once habit no longer has a job to do. And that's still unfolding for me, in ordinary moments, in small decisions, in places where I used to feel driven and now just feel present. It's nothing dramatic, it's nothing announced. Just the quiet return of choice, where it had been missing for a very long time. And so most days, this doesn't look like anything special. It looks like making coffee and realizing I'm not rushing it. It looks like answering a message without that familiar tightening in my chest. It looks like noticing a moment where I would have reacted before and realizing nothing's actually pulling me there now. There's no announcement when that happens, no internal marker that says something important just shifted. It's only later that I recognize it, usually in passing, usually without trying. I'll catch myself doing something differently and think, wow, that used to feel compulsory. and now it doesn't. And that's how it shows up for me. Not as change exactly, more like a quiet absence of pressure. The sense that I'm not being carried forward by something old in quite the same way. And life just keeps going around that. The day doesn't rearrange itself. The world doesn't get easier. I still have habits. I still have patterns. They just don't all feel ancient anymore. So some of them feel current. Some of them feel chosen. And some of them feel like they belong to who I am now, not who I had to be once. And when something old does show up, I don't rush to fix it. I don't argue with it. I don't assume it means I've gone backwards. I recognize it. Then I keep living my day. And that's usually enough.